Is this really where you've been hiding, little bird? The voice was like velvet over gravel, expensive, deep, and hauntingly familiar. I didn't look up immediately. My fingers were too busy smoothing the stray hairs away from my 4-year-old daughter's forehead. She was asleep, her head heavy against my thigh, her small breaths the only thing keeping me anchored to the world. We were sitting on a plastic-covered sofa in the lobby of the downtown family shelter. The air smelled like industrial floor cleaner and desperation. I looked up and my heart stopped. Standing there in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my entire education was my grandfather. He looked exactly the same as the day he left for Canada 10 years ago. Sharp eyes, a silver mane of hair, and an aura of effortless power. "Grandpa," I whispered. My voice cracked. I hadn't used that word in years. My parents told me he'd cut us all off. They told me he wanted nothing to do with a disgrace like me. He didn't hug me. He didn't cry. He just looked around the bleak, gray room, his lip curling in a flicker of genuine confusion. Then he looked back at me, at my frayed sweater, and the donated shoes on my daughter's feet. "I don't understand," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "Why aren't you living in the $50 million mansion I gave you on Crestview Drive?" The world tilted. I felt a cold rush of nausea. "What?" I breathed. "What mansion?" "Grandpa, I've been working 3 jobs just to keep us out of the rain. Mom and Dad said you left us with nothing. They said you were ashamed of me." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing into 2 icy blue slits. "Oh, I signed the deed over to you the day you turned 21. A trust, fully funded. I sent the keys and the legal documents to your father to hand over to you. Personally, it was my gift to my only granddaughter. My legacy." I felt like I was drowning. For 3 years, I had been the family pariah. When I got pregnant and the father walked away, my parents, the pillars of the community, had kicked me out. They told me I was a stain on their reputation. They watched me struggle. They watched me go hungry. They even called me occasionally just to remind me how much of a failure I was compared to my successful brother. "I never saw a key," I said, my voice rising with a sudden sharp edge of realization. "I never signed a paper. I've been living in a car, Grandpa. I've been cleaning toilets to buy milk." My grandfather's face transformed. And it wasn't sadness. It was a cold, calculating rage that made the air in the shelter feel like a refrigerator. He looked at my sleeping daughter, then back at me. "They thought I was nothing," I whispered to myself, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "They thought they could steal my life while I was down." "They made a very big mistake," Grandpa said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed invitation. It was for the family's annual Legacy Gala, a massive event my parents hosted every year to show off their wealth. It was happening in 48 hours. "They think I'm still in Toronto. They think you are buried under the weight of the poverty they forced on you." He held out his hand. "I stayed quiet for 10 years, and they grew bold. Now, we're going to show them exactly what happens when you steal from a lion." I looked at his hand. I looked at my daughter. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of hopelessness lifted, replaced by something hot and sharp, something that felt like justice. "What they didn't know," I said, taking his hand, "is that I'm not the scared girl they kicked out anymore." But as I stood up, a terrifying thought hit me. If they stole a $50 million house, what else had they taken? And how far were they willing to go to keep me from finding out? That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just about a house. This was a war. I'm so glad you're here for the start of this journey. This is a story about the masks people wear and the moment they finally slip. Before we continue, I have to ask, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. If you're ready to see what happens when the truth comes out, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Whispered Wrongs. It really helps the channel grow so I can keep sharing these stories with you. The hotel suite Grandpa took us to was larger than the entire floor of the shelter. It smelled of jasmine and expensive leather. My daughter, Lily, ran her hands over the velvet cushions as if she were touching something from a fairy tale. I just stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the city lights, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. "Drink this," Grandpa said, handing me a glass of amber liquid. It burned all the way down, but it stilled the shaking in my hands. "Why did they do it?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. "They are my parents. They have their own money. Why steal a roof from their own daughter? Why let me suffer like this?" Grandpa sat across from me, his expression unreadable. "Greed isn't about need, my dear. It's about ego. Your father always resented my success. He felt overshadowed. By taking your inheritance, he didn't just get a house. He got to keep you under his thumb. He got to play the role of the disappointed father while secretly fattening his accounts with your future." That's when it clicked. Every time my mother called me over the last 3 years to tell me I was a burden to the family name, she was likely calling from a room she had bought with money meant for me. Every time my brother bragged about his new tech investments, he was likely using the interest from my trust fund. I stayed quiet, I whispered, staring at my reflection in the dark glass. I stayed quiet and accepted their insults because I thought I had failed them. I felt guilty for being poor. "And that was their biggest victory," Grandpa replied. "But tonight, the silence ends." He snapped his fingers, and 2 women in professional suits entered the room. They were carrying garment bags and vanity cases. "What is this?" I asked. "Transformation," Grandpa said. "If you're going to walk into that den of vipers, you won't go as a victim. You will go as the owner of the house they've been squatting in." For the next 4 hours, I was scrubbed, polished, and painted. They worked on my hair until it shone like spun silk. They did my makeup until my eyes looked like flint. But the real change happened when they opened the final garment bag. It was a dress of midnight emerald silk. It was modest, elegant, and screamed of old money. When I stepped into it, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Gone was the tired waitress with the red-rimmed eyes. In her place stood someone cold, someone formidable. "I should have walked away," I muttered, looking at my hands. "I should have just taken Lily and run as far as possible once I knew the truth." "Why?" Grandpa asked, standing behind me. "Because if I go through with this, there's no going back. I'll destroy them." They destroyed themselves the moment they decided a piece of real estate was worth more than their child, he said firmly. As I looked at my reflection, I realized something terrifying. My parents didn't just steal a house, they stole 3 years of Lily's life. They stole her stability. They watched her cough in a cold car and didn't offer a dime while they sat in a $50 million mansion that belonged to her mother. Slow, dark heat began to spread through my chest. The sadness was being crowded out by a very specific kind of hunger. What they didn't know was that I've been keeping records, I said suddenly. Grandpa tilted his head. Records? In the shelter, you have to be meticulous. I have every text message, every email where they told me I deserved to be homeless. Every time I begged for $50 for Lily's medicine and they told me to learn the value of hard work. I kept them all because I wanted to remember why I was fighting to survive. I turned to look at him. But now I'm going to use them to make sure they never survive this. Grandpa smiled for the first time. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had built an empire by knowing exactly when to strike. The gala begins at 8, he said. They've invited the entire city to celebrate their philanthropy. They're even auctioning off a charity prize for disadvantaged youth. The irony is delicious, don't you think? I think I'm going to make them choke on it, I replied. But as I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed in my old, cracked purse. It was a message from my mother. Don't bother calling us for a while. We're very busy with the gala. Try to have some dignity and stop embarrassing us with your situation. It's pathetic. I stared at the screen. I didn't cry. I didn't even get angry. I just tucked the phone away and looked at Grandpa. This is where they made their biggest mistake, I said. They think I still care about their opinion? We left the hotel in a blacked-out limousine. As we drove toward the prestigious neighborhood where the elite lived, I saw the gates of Crestview Drive approaching. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. What would I find inside? How many of my things had they thrown away? How many of their lies were built into the very walls of that house? Are you ready? Grandpa asked as the car slowed down in front of a massive illuminated estate. I looked at the gold numbers on the gate. The house I never knew I owned? No, I said, stepping out of the car. I'm much more than ready. The iron gates of the Crestview estate swung open like the jaws of a giant. As the limousine rolled up the winding cobblestone driveway, I felt a strange sense of vertigo. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress, manicured hedges, white marble fountains glowing under spotlights, and a fleet of luxury cars that looked like a sparkling jewelry box spilled across the pavement. My parents had always lived well, but this was different. This was obscene. This was the $50 million secret they had kept while I counted pennies for a gallon of milk. Breathe, Grandpa said, his voice a low vibration in the dark interior of the car. They are nothing but actors on a stage you own. Remember that. I stepped out of the car, the emerald silk of my dress whispering against my legs. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of expensive perfume and wood smoke from the outdoor fire pits. I could hear the tinkling of champagne flutes and the hum of a string quartet from inside. I stayed quiet for so long, I whispered, looking up at the towering glass facade. And that scared them more than they realized. They thought my silence was submission. They didn't realize I was just gathering the strength to scream. We walked toward the massive oak doors. 2 security guards in sharp suits stood at the entrance, checking names against a digital tablet. When they saw Grandpa, they froze. They didn't recognize him. He had been away too long. But they recognized the aura, the raw, unfiltered power of a man who doesn't ask for permission. Name, one asked, his voice wavering. The owner, Grandpa said simply. He didn't wait for a response. He pushed past them, and I followed, my head held high, my heart a drum in my chest. The foyer was breathtaking. A crystal chandelier hung from a vaulted ceiling, casting fractured light over a crowd of the city's elite. And there, in the center of the room, were my parents. My mother looked radiant in a champagne-colored gown, draped in pearls that I now realized were likely paid for by my trust's dividends. My father stood beside her, laughing with a local politician, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. They looked so happy, so settled, so utterly convinced that they had gotten away with it. This is where they made their biggest mistake, I murmured to Grandpa. They forgot that ghosts eventually come home. We moved through the crowd like a sharp blade through silk. People turned to stare. They didn't recognize the disgraceful daughter in this elegant woman, but they sensed the shift in the room's energy. I saw my mother's eyes scan the crowd. She was looking for someone, probably a waiter to fetch more hors d'oeuvres. Her gaze landed on us, or passed over, and then snapped back with such violence, I thought she might get whiplash. Her face went from a practiced socialite smile to a ghostly, curdled white in 3 seconds. The wine glass in her hand tilted precariously. I should have walked away, I thought as I watched her panic set in, but then I'd never get to see this. I didn't rush. I walked slowly, savoring every inch of the marble floor that legally belonged to me. My father noticed her distress and followed her gaze. When he saw me, and more importantly, when he saw the man standing next to me, his face turned a mottled, bruised purple. What they didn't know was that the nightmare they tried to bury was about to become their only reality, I said under my breath. We reached them just as my father tried to usher his guests away, his movements frantic and clumsy. Dad, I said, my voice smooth and cold as a river stone. Mom, you look surprised. Didn't you get the message that the guest of honor had arrived? You, my mother hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. What are you doing here and in that dress? Who did you steal that from? She still tried to humiliate me. Even now, with her own father standing right there, her first instinct was to claw at my dignity. She didn't steal it, Charlotte. Grandpa intervened, his voice booming softly, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. In fact, I believe everything in this room, including the very floor you're standing on, belongs to her. The silence that followed was absolute. The string quartet seemed to fade into the background. The politician my father had been talking to stepped back, sensing the coming explosion. What is he talking about? My mother stammered, looking at my father. He's old, he's confused. I am many things, Grandpa said, stepping into my father's personal space, but confused is not one of them. I've spent the last 48 hours with my lawyers. It's amazing what you can find when you start pulling on the threads of a family trust. My father's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at me, then at the wealthy guests who were now shamelessly eavesdropping. That's when everything changed, I thought. The power hadn't just shifted, it had completely inverted. I wasn't the girl begging for a place to sleep anymore. I was the landlord. I think we should take this to the study, my father managed to choke out, his eyes darting around the room. No, I said, stepping forward, and I felt a surge of adrenaline so pure it made my fingertips tingle. I like it right here, under the lights, where everyone can see the charity you've been practicing. I looked at my mother, who was trembling so hard her pearls were rattling. Tell me, Mom, which room is mine? I'd like to go put Lily down for a nap. Or did you turn my bedroom into a walk-in closet for the clothes I bought you? The guests began to whisper. The word trust and theft started to ripple through the room like a virus. You're making a scene, my mother whispered, her face twisted in a mask of hatred. You're embarrassing yourself. No, I replied, leaning in so only she could hear me. I'm not the one who should be embarrassed. I stayed quiet while you let my daughter sleep in a car. I stayed quiet while you called me a failure. But that's the problem with silence, Mom. When it finally breaks, it shatters everything. And then I realized the truth. They weren't just afraid of the money. They were afraid of the story. And I was about to tell it to the whole world. The air in this grand foyer was thick enough to choke on. My father's hand was gripping his champagne flute so tightly I expected the crystal to shatter. He looked at me, then at the guests, trying to summon that booming, authoritative voice he used to intimidate me when I was a teenager. This is a private family matter, he announced to the crowd, his face a mask of forced joviality. My daughter has struggled with her mental health. She's clearly had a lapse. Please, enjoy the music. We'll be back in a moment. He reached out to grab my arm, his fingers hooking like claws. In the past, I would have flinched. I would have let him lead me into a dark corner where he could hiss his venom until I felt small again. But I didn't move. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his eyes. "Don't touch me," I said. It wasn't a scream, it was a command. And don't lie to these people. They're your friends, aren't they? Don't you want them to know how successful you've been at managing my assets? What they didn't know was that I wasn't just here to talk, I thought. I was here to dismantle them. I reached into the small, elegant clutch Grandpa had bought me. I pulled out a folded piece of paper, a high-resolution scan of the original deed Grandpa had signed 10 years ago. I held it up, not for my father, but for the politician and the socialite standing closest to us. "This is the deed to 14 Crestview Drive," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the hall. "Dated 10 years ago. It lists me as the sole owner. It was never meant to be a family home. It was a gift from my grandfather to me. Yet I spent last night in a shelter with a 4-year-old. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My mother made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat. "You're delusional," she spat, her voice cracking. "We took you in when you were pregnant. We gave you everything. You kicked me out? Because I wouldn't sign away my rights? To a trust I didn't even know existed yet," I countered. "You told me I was a disgrace so you could keep me far away from the mail, far away from the lawyers, and far away from the truth." I turned to my grandfather. "They thought I was nothing. But they forgot who raised me. They forgot that I have your blood. I, too." Grandpa stepped forward, his presence cutting through my father's desperate bluster. "I've spent the morning with the bank, David," he said to my father. "The signatures on the withdrawal slips for the maintenance of this house, they look an awful lot like yours. But the account they're coming from has my granddaughter's name on it. That's called embezzlement, or if we're being less formal, it's just plain theft." My father's bravado finally broke. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor waiting for the rope to snap. "I did it for the family," he hissed, stepping closer to us, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "The business was failing. We would have lost everything. You were young. You didn't need a house like this. Besides, we were protecting your future by keeping the family name intact." "By letting your granddaughter go hungry?" I asked. "By watching me work 16-hour shifts while you hosted galas in my living room? Was that for the family name too?" "I should have walked away," I whispered, almost to myself. "I should have just taken the house and let you rot. But then I realized, you didn't just steal my money. You stole the person I could have been for the last 3 years. You stole Lily's peace." That's when everything changed, I realized. I didn't want their apologies. I didn't even want their guilt. I wanted them to feel the same cold, hollow uncertainty I felt every night when I didn't know if I'd have enough for the bus fare. I looked around the room. My brother was standing near the grand staircase, a glass of scotch in his hand, I looking horrified. He had been living in the East Wing, driving a sports car that was no doubt funded by the same stolen trust. "And you," I said, pointing a finger at him, "you knew. You watched me beg for help with Lily's doctor bills, and you laughed. You told me to get a second job." My brother looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "This is where they made their biggest mistake," I said to the crowd. "They thought because I was a mother, because I was alone, I was weak. They thought I would be too ashamed of my poverty to ever stand in a room like this again." I stepped toward the microphone on the small stage where the string quartet had been playing. The musicians stepped back, sensing the shift in power. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more, I whispered into the mic, my voice booming through the entire estate. Because while I was quiet, I was learning. I was surviving. And now I'm the one holding the keys. I looked at my father, whose face was now a pale, sickly gray. "The police will be here in 20 minutes, Dad," I said calmly. "Grandpa's lawyers are already filing the injunction. You have until then to pack a bag. But don't take anything from this house. Because as of tonight, you're just a guest who has overstayed his welcome." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 3 years of lies. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me, but as I looked at my mother's face, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was something sharper, something desperate. "You think you've won?" she whispered, stepping toward the stage. "You have no idea what I did to make sure you never got this house. You think a piece of paper is enough? I burned the original documents years ago." I smiled. It was a slow, dangerous smile. What they didn't know was I found the digital backups in the safe deposit box you forgot Grandpa had access to. My mother's face twisted. The graceful socialite mask she had worn for decades didn't just slip, it shattered. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. "You think you're so smart," she hissed, her voice loud enough now that the guests near the stage began to back away in discomfort. "You think you can just walk back in here after dragging our name through the mud with your situation? You were a mistake from the beginning." The room went ice cold. Even the most hardened gossips in the crowd flinched at the cruelty in her voice. "I stayed quiet," I said. My voice amplified by the microphone, steady and echoing. "I stayed quiet when you told the neighbors I'd moved to Europe. I stayed quiet when you told the family I was a drug addict to explain why I wasn't at Christmas. But that's the thing about the truth, Mom. It doesn't need a fancy dress or a $50 million stage to be real. It just needs to be spoken." I looked over at my father. He was frantically texting on his phone, probably trying to reach his own lawyers or move money between accounts. "That's when I realized the truth," I said, looking directly into the lens of a guest's phone as they recorded the scene. "It was never about the scandal of me having a baby. It was about the math. If I was unstable, they could keep the house. If I was disappeared, they could keep the trust. My daughter and I weren't family to them. We were just liabilities standing in the way of a luxury lifestyle." "David, do something," my mother shrieked, turning to my father. But my father was looking past her. He was looking at the front entrance. 2 men in dark suits had entered, followed by a woman carrying a leather briefcase. Grandpa's legal team had arrived, and they didn't look like they were here for the champagne. "This is where they made their biggest mistake," I said, stepping off the stage. I walked right up to my mother. She tried to recoil, but she was backed against the mahogany piano. "They thought I was nothing because I had nothing. They forgot that when you lose everything, you lose the fear of losing anything else." I turned to the lead lawyer, a woman with eyes like a hawk. "Is the injunction ready?" "It is," the lawyer replied, her voice crisp and professional. "The court has issued an emergency freeze on all assets tied to the estate. We also have a signed affidavit from the notary who was bribed to forge the transfer papers 3 years ago. He decided to talk the moment he heard your grandfather was back in the country." My father dropped his phone. The sound of it hitting the marble was like a gunshot. "A notary?" he whispered, his face drained of all color. You found him?" What they didn't know was that Grandpa kept a shadow file, I said, a small triumphant smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "He didn't just send the papers to you, Dad. He sent a duplicate set to a private vault in Vancouver. He was testing you. He wanted to see if his son was the man he hoped he was, or the man he feared he'd become." Grandpa stepped forward, now placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. The weight of it felt like a shield. "You failed the test, David. miserably. I should have walked away, I thought, looking at the wreckage of my parents' dignity. But I didn't. Because Lily deserves to know that her mother didn't just survive, she won. The socialites were now openly whispering, their phones held high. The Legacy Gala had turned into a live-streamed execution of my parents' reputation. The very people they had tried to impress were now the ones broadcasting their downfall to the world. "The police are at the gate," the lawyer added. "They're here to escort any unauthorized persons off the property. Since the deed is in my client's name, she has the right to decide who stays." I looked at my mother. I looked at her pearls, her champagne gown, on in the smug arrogance she had used as a weapon against me for 3 years. "I want them out," I said. "You can't do this," my mother screamed. "I am your mother." "A mother doesn't watch her grandchild shiver in a shelter while she sleeps on 800 thread count sheets," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry further than a shout. "A mother doesn't steal a child's future to pay for a fountain. You're not my mother. You're just the woman who let me down." I turned to the guests. "The party is over. Please leave your glasses on the tables and exit through the front. My daughter is coming home tonight, and I want the house clean before she arrives." As the crowd began to shuffle toward the door, silent and stunned, I saw my father collapse into a chair. He looked small. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like a giant. He looked like a thief who had finally run out of shadows to hide in, but as the police walked through the door, my mother did something I didn't expect. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked over to a heavy crystal vase on a pedestal, an antique that had been in the family for generations, and she smashed it against the floor. If I can't have this life," she hissed, "nobody can." The sound of the crystal vase shattering was like a lightning strike in a small room. Shards of ancient glass peppered the floor, glinting like diamonds in the rug. My mother stood there, chest heaving, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She reached for another ornament, a hand-carved jade figurine, but before she could wrap her fingers around it, a firm hand gripped her wrist. It was Grandpa. He didn't use force. He just held her with the steady, immovable weight of a man who had seen through her for a long time. "That's enough, Charlotte," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was tired. "You've spent 3 years breaking things. You've broken your daughter's heart. You've broken your family's honor. You will not break another thing in this house. It doesn't belong to you." "Nothing belongs to her," my mother shrieked, swinging her gaze to me. "She was a mistake, a weak, pathetic mistake who couldn't even keep a man. Why should she get the empire I spent my life maintaining?" I walked toward her, stepping over the broken glass. I didn't feel afraid. The woman who used to make me tremble with a single, judgmental look now just looked, small. "You didn't maintain an empire, Mom," I said, stopping inches from her. "You were a squatter. You lived a lie and called it a legacy. And as for me being a mistake, I survived the worst you could throw at me. I raised a beautiful, happy child while living in a shelter you helped put me in. If that's weak, I'd love to see what you think strong looks like." I stayed quiet, and that scared them more, I reflected, seeing the way my father flinched at my words. They had expected me to be loud, to scream, to be the unstable girl they had painted me as. By remaining calm, I was denying them the only weapon they had left, the ability to call me crazy. The police officers stepped forward now. One of them, a woman with a sympathetic but firm expression, placed a hand on my mother's shoulder. "Ma'am, we need you to step away. The owner has requested that you leave the premises immediately." "The owner?" My mother laughed, a jagged and manic sound. "I am the mistress of this house." "No," I said, pulling a heavy silver keyring from my clutch, keys Grandpa had handed me in the limo. I held them up so they caught the light. I am the owner, and I'm revoking your invitation. My father finally stood up from his chair. He looked aged by a decade. The purple hue had left his face, replaced by a gray, papery pallor. He didn't look at my mother. He didn't look at the police. He looked at the floor. "It was supposed to be a loan," he muttered, his voice hollow. In my head, I told myself I was just borrowing the equity, that I'd pay it back before you ever found out. But the market, not the business, it just kept eating more. What they didn't know was the depth of the hole they had dug, I thought. My father had been chasing his own tail for years, using my inheritance to cover his failures, then using more of it to cover the tracks of the first theft. It was a cycle of greed, fueled by the belief that I was too broken to ever come looking for what was mine. "You didn't borrow it, Dad," I said. "You stole it. You stole the safety of your own grandchild. Do you know Lily had a fever last month that lasted 4 days? I couldn't afford the good medicine. I sat up all night with a cold rag, praying she'd be okay, while you were probably sitting in this very room drinking scotch that cost more than my monthly wages." My father's shoulders slumped. He finally looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who used to tuck me in before the greed took over. But it was too late. I stayed quiet, but I'm done now, I said. "David, tell them," my mother urged, grabbing my father's arm. "Tell them she's lying. Tell them we have the papers." "There are no papers, Charlotte," my father said, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "It's over." The officers began to lead them toward the door. My brother followed behind them, his head tucked low, trying to hide his face from the few lingering guests and the cameras that were still rolling near the gates. He had enjoyed the spoils without ever asking where the money came from. He was just as guilty in his silence as they were in their actions. As they reached the threshold of the massive oak doors, my mother turned back one last time. "You'll fail," she hissed. "You don't know how to run a life like this. You'll be back in that shelter within a year." "Maybe," I said, looking around the cavernous, glittering foyer. "But if I am, it'll be because I made my own choices, not because someone I loved stole my life from under me. Goodbye, Mom." The doors closed. The sound of the heavy latch clicking into place was the most satisfying thing I had ever heard. The house fell into a strange, ringing silence. The guests were gone, the police were gone, my family was gone. It was just me, Grandpa, and the wreckage of a party in a $50 million tomb. "I should have walked away," I whispered, looking at the blood on my shoe from a tiny shard of glass. "No," Grandpa said, walking over to me. "You did exactly what was necessary. You didn't just take back a house. You took back your name." That's when I realized the truth, I thought, looking up at the crystal chandelier. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was cold, and it was filled with the echoes of people who didn't know how to love. "Grandpa," I said, "I don't want to live here." He paused, his eyebrows shooting up. "You don't? This is your birthright." "I want the money," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I want the assets, but I want to sell this place. I want to turn this legacy into something that actually matters. I want to build something that ensures no other mother has to sit in that shelter lobby waiting for a miracle." This was where they made their biggest mistake. They thought I wanted their life. They didn't realize I wanted to burn their version of life down and build something better on the ashes. But as I turned to head upstairs to see the rooms I had been denied, I saw a small black ledger sitting on the side table near where my father had been standing. It was his private journal. I opened it, expecting to see more financial lies. Instead, I saw a name I didn't recognize and a date. The date of Lily's birth, and next to it, a phone number and a single word, settled. My heart stopped. What did he settle? My fingers trembled as I touched the word, settled. It was written in my father's precise, aggressive handwriting. Next to it was a date I would never forget, the day Lily was born. Beneath it was a phone number and a name. Specialist Vance? No, not a name I knew, just a title and a number. I looked at the dollar amount scrawled next to the entry. $250,000. What is this? I whispered. Grandpa walked over, his eyes narrowing as he read the ledger over my shoulder. His face, already stern, hardened into a mask of pure granite. That's when I realized the truth, I thought. The house, in the trust, the stolen money, that was just the beginning. There was a deeper layer to this rot, something that went beyond greed and touched the very soul of my daughter's life. I should have walked away, I muttered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I should have just let them go, but I couldn't. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. A man answered on the second ring. Vance speaking. Who is this? I asked, my voice cold. And why did David pay you $250,000 the day my daughter was born? There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. Then, a sigh. I assume this is the daughter. Look, I'm a private investigator. Your father hired me to track down the father of your child. He didn't want him in the picture. He wanted you isolated so you'd have no choice but to rely on him and eventually or sign over your rights when you were desperate enough. I felt the air leave my lungs. What do you mean, track him down? He found him, the voice said. He paid him off. He told the boy that if he ever contacted you, he'd use his influence to ruin his family's business. He gave him $200,000 to disappear and kept $50,000 for my fee. Your father didn't just steal your house, lady. He stole your support system. I hung up the phone. The room seemed to spin. They thought I was nothing, I whispered, the words coming out as a choked sob. They didn't just watch me struggle, they engineered it. They had bought off Lily's father, a boy who had been scared but had loved me, and made him look like he had abandoned us. They made me feel unlovable and alone so they could control me. This is where they made their biggest mistake, I said, looking up at Grandpa. My eyes weren't crying anymore, they were burning. They thought money could buy a person's soul forever, but they forgot that secrets have an expiration date. I walked back to the front door and threw it open. The police car was still idling at the end of the long driveway, the red and blue lights painting the trees in eerie colors. My parents were being processed near the gate. I didn't wait for a car. I ran down the driveway, the emerald silk of my dress fluttering behind me like a battle flag. I reached the gate just as an officer was about to put my father into the back of the patrol car. Wait, I yelled. My father turned, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Maybe he thought I was coming to forgive him. Maybe he thought I'd had a change of heart. I walked right up to him, the ledger gripped in my hand. I held it up to the window so my mother could see it from the other side of the car. You paid him off, I said, my voice vibrating with a rage so intense it felt like it could shatter the glass of the cruiser. You paid my daughter's father to leave us. You made me believe I wasn't worth staying for. You let me cry myself to sleep for years, thinking I wasn't enough, just so you could keep me under your thumb. My mother's face twisted in the shadows of the back seat. He wasn't good enough for our family, she hissed. He was 10 times the man you are, I screamed. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more, I thought. But now I'm going to make sure the world hears every single word. I turned to the officer. I want to add kidnapping and witness intimidation to the list of charges. He used threats and bribery to separate a father from his child and to isolate a victim of financial abuse. The officer looked at the ledger, then at my father. The look of disgust on the officer's face was the only validation I needed. What they didn't know was that I'm not just the girl they kicked out, I said, leaning into the car window. I'm the woman who's going to make sure you never see the sun from a window that isn't barred. As the car pulled away, I stood in the middle of the street. I was a millionaire. I was the owner of a $50 million estate. I was powerful. But as I looked back at the house, I realized the power reversal wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that I no longer needed them to tell me who I was. That's when everything changed, I whispered to the night air. I don't need the mansion. I don't need the pearls. I just need to find the truth. But the biggest reveal was still coming because as I walked back toward the house, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I saw the news, the text read. I never took the money. I've been waiting for you to be free from them. I have the $200,000 in an account for Lily. Can we talk? I stood in the center of the foyer, the phone glowing in my hand like a beacon. The text message from the unknown number felt like a final crashing wave against the shore of my old life. I never took the money. I looked at Grandpa, who was watching me with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. He knew, he had seen the ledger, and he had seen the fire in my eyes. He stayed away because he thought he was protecting us, I whispered, more to myself than to him. And they told him they'd destroy his family. They told him I hated him. They built a wall of lies, $50 million high. What they didn't know was that some walls are meant to be knocked down, Grandpa said softly. For the next few hours, the mansion was a whirlwind of activity. My grandfather's legal team began the process of changing the locks and securing the perimeter. I sat in the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound books that my parents had never read, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I breathed. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, golden fingers across the marble floors, I realized that my silence was no longer a shield. It was a bridge. I called the number back. The conversation lasted an hour. There were tears, yes, but mostly there was a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He had been working in another state, building a life from scratch, keeping that $200,000 in a locked trust for Lily, never touching a cent of it because he felt it was blood money. He had been waiting for the day my parents' grip on the city loosened. That day was today. I should have walked away from the family name a long time ago, I told him. But I'm back now, and I'm the one in charge. 2 days later, the Legacy Gala was still the top story on every news outlet in the state. My parents were facing a litany of charges: embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The pillars of the community had crumbled into dust, and the city was obsessed with the fall of the House of Cards. But I wasn't watching the news. I was standing in the middle of a much smaller, sun-drenched living room in a modest house on the other side of town. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't have a fountain or a $50 million price tag. But it was mine, bought with a small fraction of the inheritance I had finally reclaimed. I had sold the Crestview estate within 48 hours. The proceeds didn't go into a new sports car or a yacht. I funneled the majority of it into a foundation I named Lily's Light, a housing initiative for single mothers and their children. This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought that by giving me a mansion, I'd become like them. They thought wealth was about the walls you build around yourself. I realized the truth. Wealth is about the walls you tear down for others. The front door opened, and Grandpa walked in, holding Lily's hand. She was wearing a new coat, bright yellow, her favorite color, And she was laughing. "Mommy!" she cried, running to me. I scooped her up, breathing in the scent of her hair. No more industrial cleaner, no more cold car seats, no more fear. "We're home, Lily," I whispered. Grandpa stood by the window, looking out at the small garden. "Your father sent a letter from the holding cell," he said, his voice neutral. "He's asking for a meeting. He says he wants to explain his side." I looked at my daughter, then at the life I had fought so hard to reclaim. I thought about the 3 years of hunger and the nights of weeping in the dark. "Tell him I'm busy," I said. "I'm busy living the life he tried to steal." That was the ultimate revenge. Not the jail time, not the public humiliation. It was the fact that they no longer occupied a single second of my thoughts. They were ghosts when I was finally, vibrantly alive. They thought I was nothing, but what they didn't know was that a woman who has survived the dark is the only one who truly knows how to handle the light. The power shift was complete. My parents had the money, but they lost their souls. I lost everything, and in the process, I found out exactly what I was made of. And as it turns out, I'm made of something much stronger than $50 million of marble. Thank you for walking this path with me. This story isn't just about a house or a hidden trust. It's about the strength we find when we're forced to stand on our own. If you've ever been underestimated or pushed aside by the people who were supposed to love you, know this: your story isn't over yet. If you found this journey as satisfying as I did, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It means the world to me and helps Whispered Wrongs continue to bring these voices to light. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where you finally stood up to someone who thought they could control you? What was your power shift moment? If you're looking for another story of justice and redemption, check out the video on your screen now. Until next time, keep your head high and your truth higher.